Honestly, that day had to probably be the best day to meet him. I was so damn bored. It had only been a few days before my 10th birthday, and I was just waiting so impatiently for it to arrive. I had absolutely nothing to do. I could have done some of my studies, I guess, but that would have just worsened the problem. Mom was too busy holding a royal court, so we couldn't do anything like we normally did. I would have been with her were it not for that rather mundane yet reasonable demands. I remember trying not to laugh my flank off at one pony who thought it was of the utmost importance that a certain street lamp be moved a few inches to the right. I miss those kind of guys. But now, the Crystal Empire has finally got up to Equestria standards in terms of living and prosperity. So, even rather serious requests where I could at least learn some history weren't there anymore. I was still trying to figure out how my mom deals with it all the time. I hadn't seen Dad all that day. Usually that meant one of three things. Either he's off on some foreign affairs, training some royal guard, or, best of all, he's with the Magisters. While the crystal ponies aren't exactly unicorns, they do still have magic. Not just like we do. Just not like we do. From what they've told me, they use the essence of the crystals to help amplify and manipulate their magic, kind of like a telescope. I have yet to figure out how they do it. I don't even know if I can. Anyway, the Magisters were our royal wizards, studying constantly of the nature of magic. They're really nice and always willing to answer any questions I have. They held my dad in some high regard, since he spends a lot of time with them, so I had a feeling I might find him there. I used to laugh at the visiting dignitaries when I was younger. I grew up in these vertical halls and corridors, but to them it was the most confusing tower maze they'd ever experienced. I still remember how embarrassed they looked when they needed to ask little Philly for directions. So, naturally, I made it to the Magister's Hall in no time, almost smack dab in the middle of the castle. The once diamond halls I was so accustomed to soon turned into more vibrant hues of rubies and sapphires. The crystal walls were still incredibly opaque, and lines of flowing magic would course through the massive corridor like veins. A perfect and vivid recreation of the signature Crystal Empire aurora slowly wiggled and danced upon the ceiling. This place always took my breath away. Not just because of the aesthetics, but also because most of the time, I wasn't supposed to be here. I was convinced this was one of those times, as there was absolutely no one in there. It was the first time I had seen the Matrix's Hall empty before, and what was even stranger was the crack I heard, coming from the door just to my right. It was unassuming, very simple. It wasn't locked, to my surprise, and, in retrospect, it fucking should have been. Being the bored and anxious filly I was, I nudged it open. The room was empty, minus a few books and desks here and there. The walls were lined with some weird dark crystal that made it look like it went on forever, and got incredibly jagged towards the back end of the chamber. The desks themselves had a multitude of books and notes, all pertaining to some sort of journal or something. I wasn't really paying attention. I was too focused on the red horn encased in a pillar of crystal. I was so baffled as to what the thing really was, and I started to canter over to it. I caught a few glances at some notes strewn about the desk. They looked like logs and journals, mentioning something about a king. The only king was my dad, but his name showed up as if he was another pony entirely. I had no idea just what the hell was going on in there. I've seen a few of the experiments the Magisters were tinkering with, but never something so sinister. Something just radiated dread throughout the room. The fact that Dad was apparently involved just made it all the more morbidly curious.
Hello there, little filly.
I jumped out of my fucking coat. Something had talked to me. I couldn't tell where it was from, but it sounded like the entire room had been talking. Who is that? I asked. I was sincerely hoping I didn't get a reply, and that it was just my mind playing tricks. But of course, the voice came back.
You do not know of me, young one? Interesting.
No, I shuddered, suddenly becoming incredibly cold. This terrible feeling of malice and spite washed over the room. I backed up, coming closer to the horn, only to see a strange black worm. The thing spewed from the horn. It swam through the crystal-like water, flying across the ceiling and walls, leaving behind a slimy trail of ink that stained the crystal. The worm then splashed up upon the wall on the other side of me, Its form took a few seconds to actually look like anything. It was a stallion. He was older and worn, but he was a pony. An ash-gray coat and ink-black mane that swam about like oil in water. And those eyes. Those damn red eyes.
I have not been gone that long, I assure you. You are Shining Armor's daughter, are you not?
He asked me, baring those lengthy fangs of his. He looked more like a panther than a pony. What? How did you...
These magisters have loose lips. Princess Skyla, if I recall correctly.
Who are you? I pressed.
You may refer to me as King Sombra.
I looked at him, confused. The only king is my dad. He laughed. The bastard thought that this was funny.
He must think he earned that title.
What are you talking about? He always ruled with Mom, I said, aggravated that this guy thought he could talk like that.
Oh, wow. They really have told you nothing, have they? Keeping their pretty little princess from the truth, eh?
The stallion morphed back into a blob of ink. Before splashing upon the wall behind me, with a twisted grin, he spoke.
They have no right to rule here.
Yes, they do! They're royalty! I countered. I had no idea what he was talking about. My parents were royalty, the rulers of the Empire. I know my dad wasn't born a prince, but that didn't matter.
Equestrian royalty, maybe. Tell me, do you know how your parents came to rule?
Back then, I really didn't know. My parents would always dodge the question. All I knew is that the Empire reappeared from being gone a very long time. As far as I knew, they took the throne because they were the only ones who could. But I was young and naive. They said the Empire reappeared after a very long time and they needed a princess, so they chose Mom. Sombra scoffed.
Oh, how wonderfully abridged. I thought they would have a little more respect than that.
You're weird, I commented, trying to hide my anxiety.
Would you like to know how your parents came to rule this empire, my curious little filly?
I looked at him, straight into those disgusting red eyes of his.
They stole it from me.
What? No, they didn't! I shouted back. He couldn't be serious.
Oh, but they did. Your parents are nothing but thieves to the throne,
he stated with a little exasperation. They're not thieves! They didn't take anything that wasn't theirs, I replied.
Oh, but they did. They lied to you, sweet little girl. They lied.
No, they didn't! I shouted, stomping my hoof. His inky form began to swim inside the walls. All around the room he spoke.
Don't you find it odd that the throne room was empty when the Empire reappeared? Don't you think that's strange, little filly?
He asked me, regaining his composure. Well, yeah, but...
Why would it be empty? Surely there must have been a king or a queen before your parents, eh? There is always a ruler, right?
Well, yeah, that kind of makes sense, I guess. I started pawing the ground. I shook my head. There's no way this creep was telling the truth. But it was empty! It was!
Were you there when it happened, little filly?
I answered reluctantly. No.
Then how do you know for sure? Have you asked anyone what happened, besides your parents?
He asked me, raising his eyebrow. No, but I don't need to. They would never lie to me. He stood right in front of me then, smiling.
Do me a favor. See that piece of paper on the desk next to me?
He asked, pointing a hoof to the nearest pearl table.
Do you think you can read it, my dear?
I stuck my tongue out at him. Why should I?
Because if you do, and I'm wrong, then I will take back everything I have said about your parents.
He continued to grin. You'll say you're sorry? I confirmed.
I promise.
I cantered over to the desk. I was just tall enough to see the top of it. I reached out with my magic until I felt the paper and grabbed it, and then tried to read it to myself. Now, I don't remember every word, but I do remember what it said. It was some sort of journal entry from some pony named Crystal Shard. He was an equestrian magister who would frequent the Crystal Empire and was now just learning the history of this place. According to his notes, the Crystal Empire had indeed reappeared some few years ago, but apparently King Sombra had also come back. He was looking to come back into rule after being gone for so long, until my parents, my aunt, and her friends came to intervene. Apparently, the battle between my dad and him was a sight to behold. As this Crystal Shard mentioned, my father's aptitude with Sombra's dark magic. This was the part that stuck in me the most. Even then, I knew what dark magic was, and I knew it was wrong to use it. However, these said my dad was good at it, and that he used it against Sombra. This couldn't be right. Dad was a chivalrous knight who would never use anything so vile. He made me a promise never to use it, just before I made him promise it too. "This is fake! You wrote this!" I proclaimed, calling him on his bluff. Or so I thought.
I'm trapped in these crystalline walls, my dear. How could I have possibly wrote them?
He reasoned. "You had someone else write this then! My dad would never use dark magic!" I screamed.
Oh, but he does. That's how he trapped me in this prison.
"You probably deserved it!" I shouted at him, furious at his lies. It was then he suddenly vaporized and rematerialized right behind me, a thin layer of crystal between us, as he glared at me. The whites of his eyes turned a very vibrant and hazy green, while purple snaked off from both of them. The next thing I knew, I was in the throne room. My mom was on the throne, but without her guards, and Dad stood next to the windows, looking out. Besides the two of them and me, the chamber was empty. What? I mumbled. My mother was alerted to my presence, and as soon as our eyes met, she glared. I distinctly remember that glare. Not one of motherly discontent, but of pure spite. I thought she hated me. That's when Dad spoke. "What are you doing here?" His voice was seething at that time. I'd never seen any of them so angry before. What do you mean? I live here," I squeaked, almost shaking out of my mother's gaze. Dad turned to me, his words spilling out through gritted teeth. "Not anymore." He slowly stomped his way over to me, fear escalating in my heart with each beat. He towered over me, his labored breathing radiating a suppressed rage that shook me to my very core as I shrunk into a ball. "Daddy, you're scaring me, please," I said, my voice barely audible. Did I do something wrong?" His voice boomed. "Because of you, Sombra is free!" I looked at him with confusion, tears welling up in my eyes. "No, I didn't mean..." I remember the absolute terror I felt when my dad's eyes changed, the whites of his eyes turning into a sickly, menacing green, and the malicious purple that trailed off of them. His glare could melt diamonds, and it was pointed directly at me. I could see Mom out of the corner of my eye, doing nothing but staring at me with the most evil indifference I could have ever imagined. "Mommy, please, something's wrong with Daddy." "Yes, there is," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "He still sees you here." What? You heard your mother. You're still here." Her eyes grew brighter with her unholy light. Tears were pouring out of my eyes as I whimpered, "Daddy, that's dark magic. You said never to use it." "I say a lot of things," was all I heard before I felt something lunging at my chest. "Skyla!" I suddenly heard. I looked around, finding myself back in the room with the dark stallion in the walls. Only now he was gone. The voice was near, and it belonged to my dad. I was scared, still thinking that he was going to hurt me, so I stayed silent. He must have seen the door open as he came rushing in, breathing heavily, and his eyes instantly locked onto me. They weren't eyes of malice or spite, though, but full of worry and concern. "There you are! Oh, I've been looking all over for you," he stated, relief washing over him as he cantered over to me. I backed away from him, still scared out of my mind out of what he wanted to do to me. "No! Stay away!" I shouted at him. He was taken aback. Honey, what's wrong? Don't hurt me! He was breathless. I'm not gonna hurt you, dear. Why would I do such a thing? I couldn't have been closer to the wall. Because you're mad at me! I remember his face shaped in utter shock. What? Honey, I'm not mad at you, and even if I was, I would never hurt you, he said. I stifled my tears. But I let Sombra go, and you were so angry, and I was so scared, and that's when I heard the bastard laugh. I froze and looked behind me. He was looking directly at me, his glare piercing through me. My dad didn't have to order me, as I instinctively leapt behind his hooves. I saw him give the image of Sombra the worst glare I had seen that day, worse than even the one he gave me in the vision.
What the fuck did you do?
Dad shouted. At that point, I had no idea who I was more afraid of. Overall, I was just frightened.
We had a lovely little discussion. Quite the eye-opener.
Sombra chuckled. Then, my fears were set into stone. I watched as my dad, my real dad, began to charge up the same dark magic, the whites of his eyes turning that sickly, menacing green, and the malicious purple that trailed off of them. My heart was consumed by fear that was becoming real, and a sense of betrayal that it didn't quite understand at the time. Sombra's gaze was left solely on me, in a manner that said, I told you so. Dad unleashed a small barrage of obsidian spikes that stabbed straight through the encased horn. Sombra from behind the walls screamed in pain, as if it actually hurt him. My father turned to me. Come on, Skyla, let's go, he started, as I backed away from him. My eyes were flooded with tears of terror as I looked at him in disbelief. I simply couldn't fathom what I saw. I quickly realized the vision was fake once I found myself back in the room, but I was in reality. My father had used dark magic and had broken the pact that I thought was so sacred. I was horrified of what he might do with it, uncertain as to whether or not his hatred in my vision would become real as well. Dad, you said you wouldn't use it, I stammered. His eyes grew wide as he realized what I meant. Off to the side, I heard Sombra laugh. His visage on the wall grinned.
Happy birthday, little filly.